Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Carbon Trust Green Business Fund webinar. It's great to see so many of you dialed in this morning, and thank you for attending. This is one webinar of a series of webinars we are delivering and have delivered under the Green Business Fund here in the UK, and other webinars are available recorded on our website. You're all muted in terms of your microphones, so you're in listen-only mode, but we do emphasize that on the screen you should be able to see a questions box which allows you, as we go through the slides, to type in any questions you have. Please don't be shy, and obviously first come first serve, so we hope to have many questions in there which we can then go through at the end of the formal presentation, which should take about 25 minutes or so. So it will give us plenty of time to go through those and answer any of your questions. Obviously, you can also ask questions during the Q&A session as well. My name is Miles McCarthy. I'm Director of Implementation here at Carbon Trust, and today's topic is renewable electricity. So, first of all, just for anybody who is new to our presentations, just a little introduction to who we are at the Carbon Trust. We're an organisation that was set up back in 2001 by UK government, funded by UK government originally. We were set up as a mission-led organisation, a not-for-profit organisation, with a mission to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. In the early years, 2001 to 2009-10, we primarily helped UK business and UK public sector using UK government funds to reduce their energy use, look at cleaner energy sources, and also looked at investing in new technologies for low carbon technologies. Since 2009-10, a lot of our UK government funding has disappeared, but we have moved our activities to a broader audience, going international, to a broader set of elements, so looking more broadly at sustainability, not just at carbon and energy, though that does remain a key focus, and a range of services and solutions that we can provide to the market. So you can see there on this slide briefly just our services cover advice, so that could be advice to businesses, advice to governments on policy or program design, or advice to public sector, cities, etc. We have quite an extensive certification and footprinting team who look at the impacts of products, services, or organizations. And you can see at the bottom of the slide there's a few of our labels and standards around reductions in CO2 emissions, in waste and water. We also have extensive and broad range of solutions looking at new technologies. That could be deploying current best practice technologies around renewables or energy efficiency, but it may also be looking at bringing forward new technologies and investment in new business models. So that's just a little bit about Carbon Trust. We're about getting on towards 200 people, still primarily in the UK, but now offices in China, South America, South Africa, and North America. So on the topic of today, I just wanted to first of all flag up that the energy markets that we are experiencing today and will continue to experience in the coming years here in the UK, but also globally, are fast evolving and are becoming a more complex landscape for organizations like yourselves to understand and to navigate and to plan against. So in terms of the actual energy markets, we are seeing new tariffs coming on board. So there are opportunities for companies to benefit from moving their consumption to different times of the day, looking at perhaps offering some form of flexibility to their demand, which can benefit future grids and matching future generation, and a wide range of renewable energy and cleaner energy solutions, which we'll touch on later. There's also a significant change to the demand profile for businesses today and looking forwards. So obviously energy efficiency has played a big part and continues to play a big part and must be recognized in any planning in terms of both obviously making your organization cost effective, by making sure you're not using excessive energy and benefiting from cost-effective energy efficiency solutions, but also future demands and energy changes, such as a big drive at the moment we're seeing, and a big area of interest is looking at the emergence of electric vehicles, and this can have quite a big impact on the consumption an organization might have on their site in the future. So for example, you could be a retail or a leisure facility where you might need to consider providing charging infrastructure for your staff, but as well as your customers, and that could have quite an influence on the supply you require onto the site. There's a growing interest in technical solutions for energy storage, and that obviously allows you to be more flexible in terms of your supply requirements and potentially benefit from changing prices of energy from different parts of the day. And obviously that moves into demand management and the opportunities that organizations are exploring these days to look at ways of perhaps moving moving their consumption from peak times when energy prices are particularly high, and moving those to lower energy types, something which here in the UK we've seen for many, many years at a basic level with things like Economy 7, where people with electric heating stored energy overnight. We're talking now much more about significant advancements in technology, but it's the same principle where there is excessive, cheaper generation to be used off-peak. If you can move your demand to those times, you can make savings, particularly using some of these new tariffs. And just touching on heating, that's another area where we would see going forwards a potential move for organisations to look at electrical heating and heat pumps as an alternative to fossil fuel generated heat solutions. And on the right hand side of this slide, sorry, this slide is taking a little bit longer than I anticipated, but it's got quite a lot of introductory elements, are some of the drivers that are encouraging organizations to look at renewable energy and renewable electricity solutions. So we are seeing a increase in the ambitions and the reduction targets that organizations are setting themselves in terms of carbon emissions, as well as local air pollution impacts. We are seeing a growing value chain interactions around sustainability. An example would be, we see, for example, the supermarkets here in the UK encouraging their supply chain to look at cleaner solutions in terms of energy use, as well as obviously energy efficiency. So that will be driving a lot of small and medium-sized organizations to consider lower emission models for their business, and a broader range of stakeholders' interests. So growing interest from customers, from other consumers, customers being either consumers or businesses, opportunities to incentivize staff around working at an organization that is looking at a more sustainable future, and also a growing interest from investors expecting to see companies evaluating and considering and implementing sustainable future business models. And we're also seeing in certain sectors a bit of a competitive race to demonstrate a more sustainable business model, which is encouraging new innovation and uptake of renewable electricity and renewable energy solutions more broadly. And we mustn't forget the commercial opportunity that renewable energy brings. We'll touch on a bit on that later, but as renewable energy generation becomes cheaper and cheaper, it isn't necessarily an expensive option. It often is a cheaper option to adopt in different markets and different opportunities. And in the press, we see significant messaging around the cost of renewables, and it is true that there are records being broken and dramatic reductions in the cost of generation of kilowatt hours of electricity from renewables around the world, from wind and from solar PV. And you can see there on the left a couple of statistics on how far the cost of generation of energy has dropped, electricity has dropped from those two main sources. Here in the UK, we're seeing huge investment in offshore wind, and Carbon Trust has been working with a lot of the developers in that area to reduce the cost of offshore wind, and the cost per megawatt hour of offshore wind generation has plummeted significantly, and gone flying past the levels that were anticipated. So, and that will only continue. So that's a very positive sign. In fact, you know, we've heard it before in the 1950s with nuclear, but people are talking about future renewable generation being almost too cheap to meter. Okay, we'll have to wait and see, but there are some very interesting case studies of really quite dramatic drops in the cost of delivery of energy through renewables today and looking forwards. And on the right, we can see the UK picture and the growing importance and contribution that renewable electricity is delivering to our grid. I think the most important and impactful statement is that one. The second one, which shows you the carbon intensity of our mix of grid generated electricity. Over a pretty short time window of 5 years, we've seen more than halving of the carbon emissions from the mix of grids. So renewables plus nuclear makes up over 50% last year of the consumption in the UK. And we're seeing, yes, as I said, a dramatic increase in the uptake of renewables and planned adoption of renewables in the UK. Just a little bit broader than that, and just to sort of understand the sort of evolution of those costings, this is an interesting chart which does require a little bit of explanation. So you can see here the evolution from 2010 to 2020, and you can see on the y-axis of each chart the level of solar irradiation in different countries. And so how sunny your country is, you're higher up the chart on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the typical cost of electricity, in that country. And the bubbles represent both industrial in blue and orange is residential. The location and the market size, bubble size, for each country in Europe. So what you can see here is at the very top of the first chart, Israel, small market, both in industrial and residential, very high level of solar irradiation, average energy price. Going to bottom right, big markets in Germany, high energy costs and relatively lower levels of solar radiation. And the blue shading, if you can see it coming through as blue, of the chart, which creeps across the chart over the decade to the point in 2020 where only the very low cost energy markets of Ukraine and Russia are outside of the blue shading. Basically, it shows the progression of solar PV generation in terms of being cost parity with fossil fuel generation. So you can see over that 10-year period, most of Europe markets have been consumed by solar projects in terms of being able to match energy price generation or delivery in those markets. And there's similar dramatic charts for other parts of the world, but really this is reflecting the growing competitiveness of solar PV in this example, and the dramatic reduction in the cost and delivery of energy through that solution. In terms of companies making commitments, and what is driving a lot of activity in the market is the growing significant ambitions that are being set by corporates around the world, and this will impact on renewable electricity markets significantly. And here in the UK, it is impacting significantly with big companies like Tesco's and BT, who are big consumers of electricity, locking in renewable electricity supply. But also, as I said earlier, a lot of these larger companies often have significant numbers of relationships in their supply chain with small, medium and large organizations, and they are growing in their ambitions to drive reductions and adoption of renewable electricity in their supply chains as well, and potentially downstream as well. So RE100 is a initiative launched by the Climate Group in partnership with CDP, and fundamentally RE100 is a commitment that corporates can make where they commit to switching to 100% renewable electricity in their organization globally. And the number, this slide I keep updating. Today it's at 140 organizations, and there's a lot of very large organizations there with major estates around the world. including a lot of states in the UK. And the size of the RE100 family continues to grow, and you can see there that chart on the right is slightly out of date. That was as of the end of last year, I think, and the size of that group of consumers is already larger than a number of countries, including Poland, and is slowly moving up the ladder. There's another population of probably another 100 companies that we believe are out there that have already made similar commitments without signing up officially to the RE100 initiative. But this is a growing momentum of very significant commitments being made and actions then being taken off the back of it to meet these commitments, which is driving markets towards offering a greater suite of renewable electricity solutions, and also growth in the investment in new renewable energy infrastructure and plants. So this is very encouraging. It's probably ahead of the curve in terms of what's driving markets, and a lot of these companies are going around the world to each of their markets where they operate and saying to governments in those countries, this is what we've committed to, this is what we want and what we want to adopt. You need to help us do that if we're going to continue to operate in your country. So this is a very encouraging driver in the market emerging over the last 2 or 3 years, which is having quite an impact out there. And if you ask those companies why they are making these commitments and what is driving their commitments to these very significant changes to their organizations, then this chart is a summary of the responses that they've given to the RE100 program. And you can see here, obviously, renewable energy is a great way of meeting significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and meeting some of those ambitious carbon reduction targets that those companies have set, as well as their broader sustainability objectives. But there is a growing recognition that also there are significant drivers around stakeholder levers, whether it be competitors or shareholders, looking at encouraging companies to consider renewable energy. And there is a growing recognition that in terms of risk and opportunities, looking at evaluating and making the right decisions and planning ahead for making the right decisions around potential use of renewable energy in different markets can be a way of companies to mitigate some of the risks associated with energy prices and future potential meeting of targets and obligations. However, there are still significant barriers to meet those obligations, and a lot of companies perhaps make a commitment and then start to look at the practicalities of meeting that commitment, and there is a whole host of ways of doing that which we can touch on shortly, but there are still in parts of the world and in different markets barriers to meeting that obligation today, and the need to plan ahead, develop a roadmap, and maybe prioritize those areas where you can lock in renewable energy generation today to reduce your costs or to avoid rising costs elsewhere, or recognize that there may be an opportunity to lock in generation that's available today that might not be available tomorrow. So you can see here one of the biggest barriers, and one of the things that these companies' actions are helping towards overcoming is some of the barriers in certain markets around the world for adopting of renewable energy solutions. Heavily regulated markets and underdeveloped markets are being encouraged to open up and to meet some of these early demands, which can obviously help long-term open up those markets to a greater adoption of renewable electricity. And just finally, in terms of the RE100 community, this is a summary of their different routes of meeting their obligations as of end of 2016. And what's interesting on this chart is just to look at the changing approaches between 2015 and 2016. So the second line down there is showing that there's a reduction percentage-wise in the amount of their renewable energy adoption that is coming from certificates. Still an important area and probably a growing market, but in terms of percentage-wise, a reduction there. And the third line down, the one below that, is showing a growth from a very low level and still at a low level, but a clear growth in the number of companies that are making longer-term, more committed commitments to generators of renewable electricity to supply their business with renewable energy. So the certificates is a lower commitment, easier route, but the commitments through a procurement route is locking in that generation and making a longer term commitment to that supply. And that's a direction which we're seeing quite a lot of activity in, and I'll show a few examples shortly. So just quickly to run through the different options of how companies may meet or source renewable electricity in their home market or their markets they operate in, and here in the UK, all these options are available. And the order that this chart shows these options in is the order of, you could argue it's almost a sort of level of greenness or commitment level. So the first one is having renewable energy technology, renewable electricity generation on your site, owned by yourselves. It could be solar PV. Typically, it will be solar PV on the roof of your buildings, maybe on-site wind, but more likely solar PV. And now that clearly demonstrates a strong commitment to renewable energy, potentially a significantly lower cost of generation because of the avoidance of using the grid, but it's not going to meet most companies' almost any company's full requirements, and there's likely to be a limit to the scale of generation that can be met through that route. But it's still an important area, and some very interesting commercial models to look at adopting renewables on your site. The next one down is similar, but it's on-site or close to your site, where somebody else is installing and owning perhaps the generation technology, but you are benefiting from that and taking that consumption of renewable electricity from that kit. Again, likely to be limited in terms of meeting all of your energy demands, could deliver cheaper or similar cost because, again, avoiding the grid, but it does have that lack of ability to meet all your requirements. The next level is the area that we're seeing quite a lot of growth in from a small base, but a lot of activity. And this is where companies commit long-term, perhaps 8 to 10 to 12 years, to take energy from a renewable energy generator. But the difference here is that you are using the grid to deliver that power to your site or sites. So there is a disconnect between the generation and the sites, and the grid is being used to balance that. But you are making that commitment long-term to taking that power. You are supporting the development of new renewable generation capacity, and a lot of companies are using that as a very credible way of meeting their demands, as well as demonstrating a long-term commitment to renewable energy. Moving on from there, here's just a very brief example of Google's model. They're using this extensively, and basically what happens is Google have a contract directly with the renewable generator, and the renewable generator passes the renewable generation certificates to Google directly, but the power itself is exported from the generation into the grid, and there may be a market contract there as a supply of renewable energy. The data center or data centers then dotted around the country buy power equivalent levels from the grid, again at market rates. So it's not the same electrons that are being transferred from the generation to the Google data centers, but they are matching their consumption to generation that they've contracted with, perhaps at a fixed price, and they are retiring and receiving those certificates. So basically owning that clean generation capacity from that generation. And this is a model that's growing in appetite in the market here in the UK. Moving forwards, a more common solution that companies are looking at, and there's a growing suite of tariffs and suppliers of utilities supplying green tariffs for companies. So this is a low carbon electricity tariff where a utility or generator will offer you an electricity tariff where they have tied in green low carbon generation, and there is certificates that have been allocated for that generation to your consumption, so that generation is ring fenced for your consumption, and obviously a lot more flexible, lower period of time for commitments, but obviously you've got the risk of the green tariff prices in the future increasing, and potentially a weakening green perception, although green tariffs are certainly seen as a credible way of companies meeting their carbon reduction targets. And then finally, moving on to certificates, again, significantly used in the market and will continue to be, easier to adopt. And this is basically buying certificates without buying the power alongside. Obviously, you buy the power separately, but basically retiring or buying those certificates that represent renewable generation somewhere on the grid or in the market that match your consumption of electricity. And again, lower levels of time commitment, but obviously a risk of the cost of those certificates to meet your consumption increasing over time. But again, extensively used, recognized in the market as a way of meeting your renewable electricity commitments and carbon reduction. So just quickly, when we talk about renewable energy certificates, there's different types around the world, from RECs in the US to guarantees of origin in Europe, and the UK has an equivalent scheme called REGOs, Renewable Energy Guarantee of Origin. But these are tradable certificates that represent a unit of electricity generation from renewable sources that can be acquired to represent your consumption and reduce the impacts of that consumption in terms of your emission reporting. And just briefly as a summary, this chart is really to show there is a range of options. Some of them are easier to implement than others, and obviously the lower down this chart, the easier it gets today to actually make that acquisition of a solution. But in terms of strength of reputation and ongoing strength of commitment, the higher up this chart you are, the stronger message you're putting out, I guess, in the market potentially to demonstrate your commitments. And the middle column really is important, just to recognise that longer term commitments, either through a power purchase agreement or by acquiring equipment, does help you to lock in generation, but also potentially avoid future price volatility. This chart really is just to recognise that as we talk about a lot of companies making these commitments and adopting various types of renewable electricity solutions, two things really to look at. One is that the rate of adoption and the rate of switch to renewables is quite different in different companies, and what's important here, I think, on this chart is there's a lot of companies that are on the left-hand side of this chart, and this chart really is relatively loosely interpreting their messaging in the market. There's nothing scientific about placing these logos, but what we're seeing is quite a lot of companies making very quick switches to renewables, often through certificated systems initially, but also looking at longer term, more robust adoption of renewables as time goes on. And the y-axis here is really just to say that some companies we see switching straight away using certificates to 100% renewables, but we are seeing some companies really leading the market in terms of either tying in generation for their own consumption, or even looking at something beyond their own consumption, looking at supporting their communities, looking at supporting their suppliers and their value chain. So quite a lot of activity in the market, sometimes even a bit of a race to the top in certain sectors where they're trying to outcompete each other and demonstrating how they are greener than others, and making more stronger commitments. And probably the strongest commitment is one where you own or you have links to a generation capacity, and you are not using the grid to balance, and you are using storage, demand management, and local generation to fully power your organization. I don't think any company is currently at that position, and that's a very ambitious point to aim for, but that would be the sort of the holy grail of renewable energy, is where you're completely self-supported, and something which some companies like Microsoft set as an ambition, but have yet to reach, I believe, anywhere in the world. And just very lastly, before we go over to the questions, just a few brief case studies just to put a little bit of flavour on this. So here's UK Land Securities, a big property owner and operator, who are using a tariff through Smartest Energy, which is a 100% renewable energy tariff backed by REGOs, which are the UK certificate scheme. And in fact, Carbon Trust has been involved in evaluating that tariff and providing a label for that tariff to demonstrate that it meets all of its claims, and those REGOs have been allocated correctly to customers' consumption. So this is a tariff-based commitment meeting. This slide, apologies slightly for the quality, but it's a photograph I took of a presentation by Tesco. But what's interesting here is for Tesco, who are one of the biggest consumers of electricity in the UK, as well as having significant consumption globally, on the left-hand side, you can see their 2018 position, where they have 54% renewables across their estate, primarily met by certificates, and a very small amount of on-site generation, which is a very thin blue piece. And you can see from here out to 2013, their strategy is to go to 100% renewables by 2030, met through a mix of a small amount of on-site generation. I don't know how much it is, but it looks maybe 10%. About 50% of their consumption will be met through PPAs, so power purchase agreements, so longer term commitments to renewable assets, and the balance, which looks roughly maybe a third, to be met through certificates. So there's an example of a very large estate company with that 100% ambition, but looking at evolving their solutions as they move through that period of time, and locking in longer term and hopefully some cheaper energy supplies over time. Another example, Unilever here. A couple of interesting things here. First of all, they are making some long-term commitments to new generation capacity. So you can see here some wind farms in Scotland, which they have made a investment in terms of commitment, but also looking beyond their own consumption and how they can support local communities and markets to benefit from that generation capacity, and maybe have a positive impact on the local communities and support them in adopting cleaner sources of energy. And BT, one of the other very large consumers of electricity here in the UK, they've been involved quite a long time in renewable energy solutions, and you can see here a number of, again, wind sites where they've made 20 and 15-year power purchase agreement commitments to meet their energy obligations. And finally, Microsoft, again, they are looking at really opening up new markets for renewables in some of the markets such as Singapore, where renewables is not a straightforward option, but they've already locked in some generation for their own consumption in Singapore and are investing in solar projects in other markets like India to meet their obligations around the world. Okay, I hope that wasn't too much of a whistle-stop tour. I hope it gave some food for thought and update on some of the changes we're seeing in the market. We're now going over to the Q&A session, and we have, looks like 5 questions so far. Please do continue to, is that 6 just popped in? Great, keep coming. So we'll do them in chronological order. So the first question, just wondering if we will have access to the information here. Some would be great for me to keep pushing to my company's commitment. So that's great, thank you for that. And the answer is the recording of this webinar will be available, and we can send that link round to all attendees after the session. What are the main markets for RECs? I'm not 100% sure exactly what's meant by that question, but in terms of renewable energy certificates globally, there are a number of different types of renewable energy certificates, from RECs in the US to GOOs in Europe, REGOs in UK, and for some markets where there aren't formally established certificate schemes, there are some schemes being developed to meet that requirement. So systems like IREC. And in terms of renewable energy certificates more broadly, there is a range of types of renewable energy certificates that are available to companies in different markets to meet their requirements. So it isn't just a matter of just buying a renewable energy certificate, and every renewable energy certificate is the same. They all represent the same amount of electricity generation, but they may be sourced from different generation capacities, different technologies. So, for example, in Europe, you may have hydro-backed renewable energy certificates, or you may have solar PV, and some companies will look at different certificates in different ways. A number of the leading companies are very keen to emphasize that they are not sourcing certificates from existing capacity, but they want to only source generation and certificates from new capacity. So they don't want to be accused of simply jumping onto existing capacity. They want to be demonstrating that they are supporting the further investment in new capacity. So there's a range of solutions for companies to look at in different markets, and there's a range of different sources of certificates in different markets. Are there initiatives through blockchain that could also help with RE targets? So I'm not an expert on blockchain, but I do know that as a technology which has come from cryptocurrencies, it is technology that's being explored in a whole range of different markets, and the energy market is one of those. And blockchain technology potentially has, I guess, a role where it can help to track and allocate renewable energy or energy generation to energy consumption. So I can see there's being some logic in that, and potentially that being a technology that may be able to address some opportunities and some needs in that marketplace. Of course, cryptocurrencies are a interesting topic when we talk about energy, because we keep hearing a lot of news around the level of electricity consumption coming from the mining of cryptocurrencies, which is becoming a very significant new consumption in the global grid, which, you know, some may argue that doesn't deliver any huge value to society, but is mopping up a lot of consumption. So there is that side of the technology areas that area that maybe is a bit controversial, or is a bit needs to be considered in terms of mitigating growth in demand for energy. Next question. Great update, mainly focused on renewable electricity. Main challenge may be renewable heat. What are the options for heat-intensive companies? Drying and steam. At the moment, it looks like biomass for steam is only option, and biomethane seems not developed. And gas grid, I think that should say, decarbonisation does not seem to happen. So yes, the presentation today is primarily on, well, it is on is on renewable electricity. And a lot of the commitments that companies are making, and certainly short-term commitments that companies are meeting, are on the renewable electricity area. But renewable heat is very important. I touched on it earlier in terms of electric heating, but renewable heat and decarbonising heat demands, whether it be space heating or industrial heating, is very important and will become a growing area of focus over time. There are a number of solutions currently and envisaged coming over the horizon, from biogas, biomethane, electric heating, heat pumps, and the markets for those are at early stages, and have a lot of development to go forwards. We are seeing some companies locking in renewable heat sources for their consumption. Carlsberg have a brewery in Sweden, which I think is Sweden, which has just switched to 100% renewable heat and renewable electricity sourcing. 25% of that renewable heat is met by biogas, I believe, that's generated on site from their effluent, and 75% is sourced through the gas grid from Ørsted, who have a biogas generation capacity in Sweden, where they are inputting biogas into the gas grid. So in effect, it's like we heard earlier about renewable electricity PPAs where the grid is used to deliver it. Here is an example of a company who are consuming gas, buying the generation that's inputted into the gas grid for their own usage. So there's some early markets. There's a growing appetite for looking at new renewable heat solutions, but there's a long way still to go in that space. How are the RECs related to carbon credits? So the RECs are a more direct link. They are a certificate that is aligned directly to generation within the market that you're operating in. They aren't necessarily linked to your consumption, but they can match your consumption. And obviously, as I said earlier, there is a range of renewable energy certificate types and sources which can be selected from and chosen, but they are directly linked to generation within that market. Small business here. Any plans for interest-free loans for PV panels? Okay. Carbon Trust has run over many years interest-free loan schemes. We still have interest-free loan available in Wales for SMEs, I believe. And solar PV is an eligible technology, I believe, in that scheme. So have a look on our website for 0% loans in Wales. In the UK as a whole, we only have 0% loans available now in Wales. Are there specific focus points you recommend looking into in underdeveloped emerging economy countries such as Bulgaria? I think the answer to that is yes. it is definitely, the options are available in many markets. Working with some of our corporate clients, we're seeing quite a wide range of developers who are exploring opportunities to develop new capacity and hopefully aligned to new demand that they can match that supply to. We're talking to a lot of renewable energy developers who are keen to meet and to discuss potential opportunities with consumers and large consumers, whether that be corporate sites. It really depends on the location and the market dynamics in a particular country as to whether there's a credible and a commercial solution today for renewable electricity projects in a particular market. But it can, it can depend on obviously local geography, generation potential, the consumption on site, and whether that's something which is, whether the company has a long-term commitment to that site or that country, where they are potentially interested in a longer-term commitment. And we're seeing also in certain markets, there's a potential opportunity for a larger corporate with a strong balance sheet actually enabling, through a power purchase agreement, enabling a commitment to bring the cost of that generation down in a market where maybe the cost of finance for grid delivered renewables is higher than the cost of financing that in other markets. So actually the role that the corporate can play in committing to taking that power can really help the economics of funding that new generation of renewable power in that country. So there's definitely opportunities in a wide range of markets, and the picture is fast changing, and a slide that is relevant today won't be relevant in 6 months' time. The market will have moved on considerably. So definitely worth exploring that, and we'd be happy to talk to anybody to help them with that. What's the view on thermal energy store? So thermal energy store, like electricity storage, is a potential solution to benefiting from cheaper energy, as well as utilizing waste heat to use for future heat requirements. And it really depends on industry, heat requirements, cost of energy, and alternative energy sources today, whether a solution is workable and credible. But there are definitely models where the opportunity to store thermal energy on site and utilize lower cost energy or waste heat is very much worth considering. So it's really the answer is depending on site, industry, and local requirements. That's all the questions we have today. Are there any last-minute questions? People are, if you're typing one in, please do it now. And if not, we're not getting anything else through. Thank you very much indeed to everyone who has participated. Thanks for your time today. I hope that was a useful presentation. Thank you, Michael, for sending through your thanks. And we look forward to speaking to you all again as a group on future webinars. But also, please don't hesitate in contacting us if you have individual specific questions or you'd like to explore any of the points in more detail. I didn't put my email address up, but it is miles.mccarthy, that's M-Y-L-E-S .mccarthy, M-C-C-A-R-T-H-Y @carbontrust.com. We'll get the link to the webinar sent out to you in case you have any colleagues you'd like to invite to listen in afterwards. And thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.